My name is Laura, and a year ago, my life seemed to take a turn straight out of a fairy tale. I met Alex at a friend's birthday party. He was charming, with a smile that could light up the room, and before I knew it, we were dating. Fast forward to now, we're engaged and planning our wedding in 3 months. I'm 24, living in my small but cozy apartment. It's not much, but it's mine. Alex still lives with his mom, Mrs. Wilson, in their family home. We've talked about buying our place after the wedding, a dream I often find myself lost in. Mrs. Wilson, well, she's a character. Always calling Alex, even when we're on dates. It's like she has a sixth sense for when we're together. I've tried to see it as a mother's love, but it can be a bit much. Then, 3 months before the wedding, Mrs. Wilson called me with an offer I never expected. "Laura, dear," she began in her usual formal tone, "I think it's time you start learning how to be a proper wife and mother for my Alex." I remember pausing, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Wilson, I'm not sure I understand." "It's simple," she continued. "You'll come over to our house every day for the next 3 months. I'll teach you everything you need to know about running a household." I was taken aback. This was not what I expected. "Every day? After work?" I asked. "Yes, dear. It's for your own good. And Alex's, of course." I hesitated, but a part of me didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with my future mother-in-law. "Okay, Mrs. Wilson, I'll give it a try." "Oh, wonderful. Alex will be so pleased. See you tomorrow evening, then." I hung up the phone, a mix of nerves and uncertainty churning in my stomach. Little did I know, this was the beginning of what would be the most challenging 3 months of my life. "Are you sure about this, Laura?" my best friend Sarah asked later that day. We were sitting in my tiny living room, a half-eaten pizza between us. "I don't know, Sarah. It seems important to Mrs. Wilson. And Alex, well, he thinks it's a good idea too." Sarah frowned, looking concerned. "Just be careful, Laura. This sounds like a lot." I nodded, trying to shake off the worry. "I'll be fine. It's just for a few months, right?" But as I would soon find out, those few months would change everything. The next few weeks blurred into a routine I never imagined I'd be in. Every day, after a long day at work, I'd drag myself to Mrs. Wilson's house. The moment I stepped through the door, it was like entering a different world. "Laura, you're here! Good!" Mrs. Wilson would greet me, barely looking up from her knitting. "Let's start with dinner. I expect you to cook something nice for us." The kitchen became my battleground. I was never a bad cook, but under Mrs. Wilson's critical eye, I felt like a complete novice. "This is how you chop onions? My goodness, girl, you're slow. And watch your fingers," she'd chide, making me even more nervous. One evening, as I struggled to get the seasoning right for a stew, Alex walked in. I hoped for some support, or at least a kind word. "Smells good, Laura," he said casually, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm just trying to get it right. Mrs. Wilson has been teaching me a lot." He laughed, a sound that once brought me joy but now felt distant. "Mom knows best. You're lucky to have her guidance." I wanted to say something, to tell him how exhausted I was, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded and went back to stirring the stew. Every task was a test. Washing dishes, ironing Alex's shirts, even vacuuming the house, Mrs. Wilson had a specific way for everything, and nothing I did seemed to meet her standards. "You need to iron the creases sharper, Laura. Alex likes them that way," she instructed one evening as I struggled with the ironing board. I tried to hide my frustration. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Wilson." And so it went. Days turned into weeks. I kept telling myself it was a phase, something to endure for Alex's sake, for our future. But as I lay in bed each night, my body aching and my mind racing, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really what my life was going to be. A never-ending cycle of trying to please someone who seemed impossible to satisfy. My friends started noticing the change in me. "You look tired, Laura," Sarah commented one day. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just busy with the wedding prep and all. You know how it is." But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the wedding stress. It was this new life I had stepped into, one where I was constantly trying to prove myself to a woman who seemed determined to find fault in everything I did. And the worst part? I was beginning to lose sight of who I was in the process. The weekdays were tough, but the weekends brought a whole new level of challenge. Mrs. Wilson hosted her relatives almost every Saturday, and I was expected to cook and cater for all of them. It was a Saturday morning, and I was already in the kitchen, a long list of dishes to prepare. Mrs. Wilson entered, her arms crossed. "Remember, Laura, my family has high standards. You need to impress them," she said, eyeing the ingredients I had laid out. I nodded, feeling the pressure. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Wilson." As the day progressed, the kitchen felt more like a pressure cooker. I was chopping, stirring, and baking, trying to keep up with the endless list of tasks. The clock seemed to tick louder with each passing minute. The guests began to arrive, and the house filled with chatter and laughter. I was in the kitchen, putting the final touches on the dishes, when Alex popped his head in. "Need any help, Laura?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. I wanted to say yes, to tell him I was overwhelmed, but I didn't. "No, I've got it. Thanks, though." He shrugged and left, joining the laughter in the other room. I felt a pang of loneliness, realizing how isolated I had become in this house. Dinner was served, and I stood back as everyone started eating. I watched nervously, hoping they'd like the food. Mrs. Wilson's sister, Aunt Linda, was the first to comment. "This is quite different. Not what we're used to, right, Margaret?" Mrs. Wilson gave me a disapproving look. "Laura is still learning. She's doing her best." The critiques didn't stop. Each dish seemed to bring another round of subtle digs and comments. I felt smaller with each word. After dinner, while everyone was relaxing in the living room, Mrs. Wilson cornered me in the kitchen. "Laura, this was not up to our family standards. You need to work harder. You made me look bad in front of everyone," she hissed. I felt tears well up in my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson. I really tried." "Trying isn't enough. You need to do better. Much better." I nodded, trying to hold back my tears as I started clearing the dishes. Later, Alex found me in the kitchen, alone, washing dishes. "Hey, don't take it to heart. Mom can be tough," he said, in a tone that was supposed to be comforting. I looked at him, my frustration finally finding words. "Alex, it's not just tough. It's too much. I'm trying so hard, and it's never enough." He seemed taken aback. "It's just how she is. She wants everything to be perfect. Don't worry, you'll get used to it." Get used to it. Those words echoed in my head as I went to bed that night. Was this what my life was going to be? Constantly trying to meet impossible standards and losing myself in the process? The thought scared me more than anything. Just when I thought things couldn't get tougher, they did. Alex's sister Julia started dropping her kids off at Mrs. Wilson's house every weekend. Julia had 2 kids, a 4-year-old boy, Max, and a baby girl, Lily. Looking after them became my responsibility. One Saturday morning, Julia breezed in with the kids in tow, her casual demeanor in stark contrast to my growing anxiety. "Hey, Laura! Great, you're here! The kids will be your little project for today," Julia said, barely giving me a chance to respond. All day?" I asked, trying to mask my surprise. "Yeah, I have a ton of errands. You don't mind, right?" Julia didn't wait for my reply, swiftly heading out the door. There I was, with 2 kids, in addition to the usual weekend chores. Max was energetic and needed constant attention, while Lily needed her diaper changed and bottle fed. Juggling between them and the kitchen was exhausting. Mrs. Wilson was of no help. "You need to learn, Laura. This is what family life is about," she said, observing me struggle with Lily and a fussy Max. By the time Julia returned in the afternoon, the house was a mess. The kids were cranky, and I was on the brink of tears. "What happened here?" Julia exclaimed, looking around the disarrayed living room. "I tried my best, Julia. Max and Lily needed a lot of attention," I explained, feeling defeated. "Well, you'll just have to get better at managing, won't you? After all, you'll have your own someday," Julia said nonchalantly, rounding up her kids. That night, after everyone had left and I was alone cleaning up, Mrs. Wilson came into the kitchen. "You need to pull yourself together, Laura. Today was not acceptable," she said, her tone cold and firm. "I'm doing everything I can, Mrs. Wilson," I replied, the day's frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not enough. You need to be more efficient, more organized. That's what being a part of this family means." she retorted before leaving the kitchen. As I sat there, surrounded by toys and dirty dishes, I felt a sense of hopelessness. This wasn't the family life I had dreamed of. It was a never-ending cycle of demands and criticisms. And with each passing day, my spirit, my very essence, seemed to be eroding away. I wondered if Alex understood or cared about how much I was struggling. But deep down, I knew the answer, and it scared me more than anything. Exhaustion became my constant companion. It followed me to work, where I found myself struggling to focus. One afternoon, it caught up with me. I was at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, when my eyes involuntarily closed. I jerked awake to the sound of my name. "Laura, are you okay?" It was my boss, Mrs. Thompson, standing by my desk with a concerned look. I sat up quickly, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson. I didn't sleep well." She pulled up a chair and sat down. "This isn't just about last night, is it? You've been looking run down for weeks. What's going on?" I hesitated, but the words just came pouring out. I told her about the wedding preparations, Mrs. Wilson's training, the weekends with Alex's niece and nephew, everything. Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her expression turning from concern to disbelief. "Laura, this isn't training or preparation. It sounds like you're being used. You're not a maid or a nanny, you're supposed to be their family," she said, her voice firm. Her words hit me hard. But I thought I was doing it for Alex, for our future. "Laura, a relationship is a partnership. It's about support and respect, not servitude. You need to think about whether this is the life you want." Her words echoed in my head as I left her office. For the first time, I allowed myself to really think about everything that had been happening. Was this really what I wanted? Was I happy? That evening, as I made my way to Mrs. Wilson's house, I felt a growing sense of dread. The familiar tasks awaited me, but now they felt even more burdensome. During dinner, Mrs. Wilson was her usual critical self. "Laura, this chicken is overcooked. You really must pay more attention." I looked up from my plate, something inside me snapping. "I'm trying my best, Mrs. Wilson. I work all day and then come here and try to do everything you ask." She looked at me, surprised by my outburst. "Well, your best isn't good enough. You need to try harder." I wanted to say more, to tell her how unfair she was being, but I couldn't find the words. I just nodded and went back to my dinner, a storm of emotions brewing inside me. Later that night, I lay in bed, Mrs. Thompson's words replaying in my mind. I realized that I had been so focused on trying to please Mrs. Wilson and Alex that I had lost sight of my own happiness. For the first time, I questioned whether this wedding, this future with Alex, was what I truly wanted. It was a scary thought, but it was the wake-up call I desperately needed. The next day, a heavy feeling sat in my chest as I went about my work. Mrs. Thompson's words had opened a door I couldn't close anymore. I knew I had to face the reality of my situation. That evening, I took an early leave from work, and instead of heading straight to Mrs. Wilson's house, I decided to take a detour. I needed some time to think, to clear my head. But as I drove around, a nagging thought kept pulling me back. I arrived at Mrs. Wilson's house earlier than usual. I didn't call ahead, which was out of the ordinary for me. The house was unusually quiet as I let myself in with the key Alex had given me. I was about to call out when I heard voices from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed closer. It was Mrs. Wilson, Alex, and his sister Julia, their voices a mix of laughter and hushed tones. "And she just keeps coming back for more," I heard Julia say, her voice tinged with amusement. "I know, it's hilarious. Laura thinks she's proving herself, but really, she's just a free housekeeper. And after the wedding, she'll be completely under our control," Mrs. Wilson chimed in, a note of triumph in her voice. I felt my heart pound in my chest. This couldn't be happening. "And the best part is, she buys all the groceries with her own money. We haven't spent a dime," Alex added, laughing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My Alex, the man I loved, was in on this too. I stepped into the living room, unable to contain my shock and anger. "How could you?" I blurted out. The three of them turned to me, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock. "Laura, how long have you been standing there?" Mrs. Wilson stammered. "Long enough," I said, my voice shaking. I can't believe I fell for all of this. I thought we were a family. Alex stood up, his face a mix of guilt and confusion. Laura, it's not what you think. We were just joking around. A joke? I laughed bitterly. I've been slaving away for months, thinking I was building a life with you, and you were all laughing at me. Mrs. Wilson tried to interject. Laura, dear, you're overreacting. We only wanted the best for you. The best for me? By treating me like a servant? By making fun of me behind my back? I couldn't hold back the tears. Julia was quiet, avoiding my gaze, while Alex seemed at a loss for words. I thought I was joining a family. I thought I was loved, but I was just a convenience to you all, I said, the reality of the situation sinking in. Laura, please, let's talk about this. Alex started, but I held up my hand. No, Alex, there's nothing left to talk about. I can't be a part of this farce. I turned and walked out the door, leaving behind the house, the people, and the life I once thought I wanted. In that moment, I felt a mix of pain and relief. It was over. The truth was out, and I was finally free from the illusion I had been living in. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the conversation over and over. By morning, my decision was clear. I couldn't marry Alex. I couldn't be part of a family that saw me as nothing more than a tool to be used. I went to Mrs. Wilson's house one last time, needing to end things officially. My heart pounded as I rang the doorbell. Alex opened the door, his eyes red, like he hadn't slept much either. Laura, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk, he said, his voice hopeful. I stepped inside, my resolve firm. We can talk, but my decision won't change. Mrs. Wilson was in the living room, her usual stern look replaced with a softer, almost pleading expression. Laura, please understand, we didn't mean any harm. It's just our way of testing your commitment, she said, trying to justify their actions. Testing my commitment? I repeated, disbelief coloring my tone. By treating me like a servant and laughing at me? Alex stepped forward. Laura, I love you. I didn't want to hurt you. It's just, my mom's way can be a bit extreme. Love isn't about testing and humiliating each other, Alex, I said, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. I wanted a partner, a family, but what you all did, it's unforgivable. Mrs. Wilson sighed. Laura, think about the wedding, the plans, the money we've spent. I am thinking, Mrs. Wilson, about my dignity, my self-respect. The wedding is off. I can't marry into this family. Alex's face fell, his earlier hopefulness vanishing. But Laura, we can fix this. Please, don't make a decision in anger. It's not anger, Alex, it's realization. Realization that I deserve better, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Mrs. Wilson stood up, her demeanor changing. You're making a big mistake, Laura. You won't find someone else who will treat you as well as we would have. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. I'd rather be alone than with people who don't respect me. Turning away from them, I walked to the door. Alex followed, his pleas fading with each step I took. Laura, please. I stopped, turning to face him one last time. Goodbye, Alex. I hope one day you understand why I had to do this. Walking away from Alex and his family felt like shedding a heavy burden, but it didn't end there. My phone became a constant reminder of the ties I was trying to cut. Alex and Mrs. Wilson kept calling, each time with a new plea or demand. One evening, as I was unwinding from work, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Wilson. I took a deep breath and answered. Laura, you have to pay us back. We spent a fortune on the wedding arrangements, she demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Wilson, I'm not responsible for the expenses you chose to make. Consider that money as a lesson learned or maybe a rehearsal for Alex's next wedding. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a huff. You're being unreasonable, Laura. I think I've been more than reasonable all this time, I replied, my voice steady. Goodbye, Mrs. Wilson. And I hung up, feeling a sense of empowerment. The calls from Alex were harder. He was apologetic, his voice laced with regret. Laura, please, I was wrong. I let Mom and Julia influence me too much. We can still make this work, he pleaded during one of the calls. Alex, it's too late. I can't be with someone who didn't respect me enough to stand up for me, I said, the finality in my voice clear. But I love you, Laura, I really do, he insisted, his voice cracking. I deserve to be loved better, Alex. Take care of yourself. And with that, I ended the call, knowing it was the last time we would speak. The following days were a mix of emotions. There was relief, but also a sense of loss for what could have been. But as I reconnected with friends and dove back into my hobbies and work, I felt a renewed sense of self. One evening, while painting in my living room, I realized something profound. I was stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. I had stood up against manipulation and disrespect, and in doing so, I had found my own voice. I didn't know what the future held, but I was optimistic. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about the possibilities ahead. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace whatever came my way.